Hello everybody, and welcome to my limited set review for Core Set 2021. In this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the commons in the set, evaluating them for limited so that you can crush your first drafts and your pre-release for Core Set 2021. Before I get to the cards, I do have to discuss my grading scale. I'm going to be using the typical limited resources patented grading scale. A's are the game winners, the bombs, the cards that are best in every scenario, especially when you're behind, helping you come back. B's are the cards that actively draw you into a color, so there's the cards that you're hoping to pick early on in a draft, and they can really be the best cards in your deck. C's are the rock-solid playables of limited. D's are the cards that you're pretty unhappy to put in your deck, but they can make the cut. And F's are strictly unplayables, where you'd be better off playing a basic land over those cards. There are also cards that are best in the sideboard, and so those get a special sideboard grade. And then there are cards that are build-arounds, though at the common slot there's not a ton of build-arounds. And build-arounds get a special grade because when you build around them, they get a lot better than if you were just to put them into a random deck. I do want to note, though, critically, I normally don't even do card grades because I think that they oftentimes underestimate the complexity of draft, because you can't just take a card grade spreadsheet and a draft and go, okay, this card is better than this card, I'll take this. This card's better than this card, I'll take this. That could leave you with a deck that just has no 2-drops, a deck that doesn't have a focused game plan, and those types of decks tend to struggle. So I really want to emphasize that what is most important is what I say about the card, not just the grade that I'm given. The grade that I'm giving, a lot of the time there's going to be a card that is a C and another card that is a C, but they're used in wildly different contexts and they're wildly different cards. So keep that in mind when I am discussing the cards, that the grade is just something that people like to hear about, but I do want to make sure that you focus on the analysis rather than just the grade. Also, if you do enjoy the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future Core Set 2021 content, and leave a comment if you have any questions about my evaluations. Without further ado, let's dive on in. Starting things off with Alpine Watchdog, this is like a typical C-. It's not a great card, but it's a card that you'll play sometimes, and there are situations where it gets better. For example, if you have any dog tribal cards, or there is an uncommon that lets you search up Alpine Watchdog, which will make you actively want an Alpine Watchdog or two, and that'll bump up its grade a little bit, but mostly it's just like a C-. It's a 2-drop. Sometimes you're going to need a 2-drop, and in those situations, it'll perform decently. Next up is an Anointed Chorister. I am not super optimistic about this card. It is quite expensive to activate, and a 1-mana 1/1 lifelink on its own is not good, so I think this card is probably a D or a D+. It'll make your deck sometimes, and it will get a little bit of a bump if you are in a deck that cares about gaining 3 life a turn, because that seems to be an archetype in the set, and there is a little bit of a life gain theme. But overall, Anointed Chorister is oftentimes going to be a card that you're not super happy to be running. Though I could be wrong, 1-mana 1/1 white cards have been overperforming in recent sets. I just think this one is not going to be part of that trend. Next up is Basri's Acolyte. This is actually a card I'm super excited to play with because I think it is great. I actually have it as the 3rd best white common. It just does a ton. Not only is it a good enabler for tokens themes, because it helps you grow your smaller tokens into bigger creatures. It helps +1/+1 counter sub-themes. It's really good to put the counter onto a creature with a keyword like flying, because a flyer naturally starts out understated, so if you give it an extra +1/+1 counter, the flyers then start hitting even harder, and flying is a really good stat to give counters to. And overall, I think Basri's Acolyte is going to be great. I think it's going to be a pretty high pick. I think it's probably going to be a B- level card, because you're going to be pretty actively searching for these. They're pretty good in multiples. Going Basri's Acolyte into Basri's Acolyte is going to be a pretty good play pattern if you can facilitate it, and it also gains you life for the decks that care about life. So it fits into every white archetype, and it's going to actively pull you into white. Next up is Celestial Enforcer. I think this card is probably a C-, though it does go up to a C+ if you have like 6 flyers in your deck or something like that, but overall it's just going to be a little bit of an underperformer. It mostly is going to fit into the blue-white flyer decks, which I'm not sure how often those are going to come together. Obviously they're going to be a lot less common than just being in a white deck, so not every white deck is going to love Celestial Enforcer, but if you have a couple flyers, you can play it in your deck, not be too embarrassed. A 3-mana 2/3 is not the end of the world, and if you can start tapping things down, it is quite nice. Next up is Concordia Pegasus. This card I think is going to be a D+, though it can be a C- in a flyers deck. When this card was first seen, or last seen, in Ravnica Allegiance, I'm not sure if it was seen before that, it was not a card that I loved. Aggressive decks don't really want a 2-drop that has only 1 power, because it just doesn't apply the pressure that you want from a 2-drop. I mean, after hitting them for 3 turns, they've taken 3 damage, whereas a lot of the 2-drops, like the Daybreak Charger, which is the next card, will get them for 3 damage in only 1 turn. That being said, flying is a relevant subtype if you have ways to put counters on it. If you have cards that care about flying, like Celestial Enforcer, Concordia Pegasus can get a bump for synergy, so I don't think it's a high pick, but it can go up in your pick order if you do care about flying. Next up is Daybreak Charger, and this card almost cracked my top 3 white commons. I think it's definitely a C+, or maybe even a B- in certain decks, but probably just a C+, because a 2-mana 3/1 on its base is really hard to get too good. But I think that this card is great. It's a 2-drop that actually has some relevance in later game situations, buffing up your random flyers for an attack, buffing up a random lifelinker so you can win a race. Those types of things are incredibly relevant for Daybreak Charger, and I think this card is going to be a pretty high pick as a result. Definitely one of those 2-drops that you're looking for. It does get a little bit worse because there are some ways to punish 1 toughness creatures. Skeleton Archer in black really comes to mind for that, but that is a 4-drop, and I think that overall Daybreak Charger is going to be a great card for the aggressive white decks. Next up is Defiant Strike. This card's going to work well with the Prowess subtheme, the Spells subtheme. If you get into a white deck that somehow has that theme, that's not going to be that common, and overall as a combat trick, it doesn't really do much for you, so I don't think Defiant Strike is going to be that good. I think it's probably just going to be a D or D+ level combat trick. Next up is Dub. This card's just going to be a straight up D. There's not really a ton of reasons to go all in on a creature like this. Sure, putting up Dub onto a Colossal Dreadmaw is going to be pretty sweet when it works out, but it just opens up you up to removal on a creature that's already going to be good on its own, that type of thing. So I don't think Dub is going to be a good card. I think it's probably a D or D-, just not the type of card that I'm hoping to play in Limited. Next up is Feat of Resistance. This card is a pretty good combat trick. Most combat tricks aren't generally super high priority because they're kind of like all fairly interchangeable, but this one's actually going to be one that you're pretty happy to have. It protects your creature from removal. It can be used to give your creature pseudo unblockable if your opponent's board is all 1 color, and it can also just be a really nice way to win a combat. So I think, and leave your creature permanently bigger. So I think this card's going to be a C, which is a pretty high grade for a combat trick because generally those are not as good as your other cards. Next up is Gale Swooper. I have this as the 2nd best white common. I have it as a B-. It's just a really nice card. It essentially is like a 4-mana 3/2 that enables an attack that you might not have otherwise had. So if your 3/1 is going to potentially be trading on the ground or be completely stonewalled on the ground, then you get an extra 3 damage. And same with like a 2/2. If your opponent has played like a 2/4 creature on the ground and your 2/2s can no longer attack, Gale Swooper reads as like a 4-mana 3/2 that does 2 damage when it enters play, which is really good, especially for the aggressive white decks. Also fuels flying synergies. I think Gale Swooper is a great card. Next up is Legion's Judgment. This is a sideboard card. There's just not enough big creatures for this to be main deckable, but in certain matchups it's going to thrive as a sideboard card. Not a high pick, but definitely a card that can do good work out of the board. Next up is Makeshift Battalion. Last time this card was seen in War of the Spark, it was not good, even though there was a counters theme, so I think it's going to be a similar case here. 3-mana 3/2 is just not a great card. There are going to be some decks that have a couple of 1-drops in them, so if you can go 1-drop, 2-drop Makeshift Battalion, maybe it could be okay, but overall I think this card's going to be a D, not really the type of card you're looking for, though maybe it's just a D+, because 3-mana 3/2 at a base level is just probably a D+ level grade, so yeah, D+ for Makeshift Battalion. Next up is Rambunctious Mutt, and this is a pretty interesting card, because normally this type of effect would be quite good, but after looking at the cards in this set at the common and uncommon level, there's not a ton of artifacts and enchantments this hits. Out of green, it hits pretty much like 1 card. Out of like at the uncommon level. In red, it doesn't really hit anything. In black, it hits a couple of random artifacts. White has very few targets, which is a little bit uncommon. Normally, there'd be a pacifism effect or something like that. That's an enchantment that Rambunctious Mutt would hit, but it just doesn't really hit a ton here. So I think it's mostly going to thrive as like a 1-of in the main deck, or maybe even as a sideboard card, because in the matchups where it kills stuff, it's going to be a great card. But when it doesn't kill things, a 5-mana 3/4 is a little bit subpar. That would be like a D level body. So I think the card's probably going to be a C, or maybe just a C- because of the lack of targets, but bringing in out of the board is going to be quite nice. And if you do play it in the main deck, don't hesitate to take this card out of your deck. I don't think you need to prioritize it. You're not going to want too many copies of it, so just having 1 is going to be fine, and you can either main deck it or sideboard it. It's not going to be a key player, though against certain decks it will be a card that you're very happy having. Blue, for example, does have several enchantments that are worth killing, so against like specifically blue decks, Rambunctious Mutt gets a lot better, which is not really typical because blue doesn't really make a name for itself on enchantments. But Rambunctious Mutt, a really interesting card. I think it's probably just going to be a C, but definitely a card that can be a feast or famine type thing. It can win you a game, or it can just be a really lackluster body. Next up is Revitalize. This card's probably just going to be a D+, though there are certain life gain decks that are going to want it, and certain spells decks that might want it too, so those decks might prioritize it a little bit higher, but generally just not a super high impact card, though if you do have some triggers for life gaining, a lot of them care about gaining 3 or more life in a turn, and Revitalize fits that perfectly. So in those decks, Revitalize does get a nice little bump, but mostly it's going to be a D or D+ level card, not really a super important, impactful card. Though it is a fine sideboard card against aggressive decks, because it can like negate an entire attack step sometimes. Next is Secure the Scene. I think this card's probably just a C, maybe just a C-, probably C- actually. It's not a super high like quality removal spell. It kills anything, but it does leave them with a 1/1, which means your aggressive ground attacking decks don't love it. Normally they'd be fine playing a 5-mana removal spell because you kill their 5-drop and then you hit them for a big attack, but a lot of the time the 1/1 is still going to trade for some of your creatures. Like you'll have a couple 3/1s, or you'll have a 1/1 token, and so the 1/1 will actually kill one of your creatures still, which makes Secure the Scene a lot worse. In a Flyers deck, it does get a little bit of a bump because the Flyers decks don't care about a 1/1 on the ground as much, because they're going to be hopefully stalling the ground with like a wall, essentially like a 2/4 or something like that, and then the 1/1 doesn't really impact that while you kill them with Flyers. But basically Secure the Scene is going to be a card that you're going to want more so in a Flyers deck or a very controlling deck than a aggressive deck, which I think a lot of white decks are going to be aggressive, so I think that the Secure the Scene gets a little bit of a knock because of that. So probably just a C- level card. Next up is Staunch Shieldmate. This card's like a classic C-, D+ level card. It is a 1-drop. A lot of the time in Limited, a 1-drop versus a 2-drop is not a huge distinction, because a lot of the time you're not going to be able to go 1-drop, 2-drop, because you just won't draw both in the same situation, or you'll draw it in the late game. And unless you have this in your opening hand, it'll just function as a 1/3. It does actually do pretty nice work if you do have like that Makeshift Battalion immediately kill them type deck, but overall I think Staunch Shieldmate is just going to be like a C-, D+. Some decks will want a 1/3, but a lot of the time a 1/3 is just not a good stat line. It does get a little bit of a bump because it's a 1-drop instead of a 2-drop, but that's not even a significant bump. So it's probably just a D+ in most decks, though some decks will evaluate it as a C-. Next is Swift Response. I have this as the best white common. It's just so much better than previous effects like this that we've seen. Destroying a tapped creature is nice because previously it might be, say, destroy target attacking creature, but that doesn't account for if you top deck this after the creature has attacked you. But now Swift Response kills that. Previously it might have been a sorcery speed, like Take Vengeance, but Swift Response accounts for that by being instant, so you can blow them out in combat. You can go for a double black that might be risky normally, but you have Swift Response, so if they go for a combat trick, you can then kill the creature anyway. So I think Swift Response is great. I think it's probably a B level card, an absolutely fantastic one at that, and one that you're going to want as many copies of as you can get. It does take a little bit of a knock because in the aggressive decks, you're going to be a lot of the time you're attacking them. So in those types of decks, it does go down a little bit to like maybe a B-. But the fact that in a Flyers deck, your opponent's going to have to race you, Swift Response is fantastic in those spots. In a lot of the more, like there's going to be some more mid-rangey or slower white decks, and Swift Response is great in those. So I think it still merits a B-level grade because it is just such an efficient removal spell with so much flexibility at instant speed. Next is Valorous Steve. This card is just great. 5 mana for a 3/3 and a 2/2. 5/5 of stats spread across 2 bodies is really nice, especially because there are cards like the Acolyte that we already looked at that puts counters on 2 different creatures. So Valorous Steed is a really nice combo with that. Single-handedly gives you the 2 bodies you need, and overall I think Valorous Steed is just going to do a lot in the format. This reminds me of the card from Throne of Eldraine that was an adventure card that could make a 2/2 and a 3/3, but that cost more than 5 mana to do because it was 3 mana for the 2/2 and then 5 mana for the 3/3, and this kind of gives you both the best of both worlds. So I think Valorous Steed is going to be a good card in the format, and definitely one that you're not going to mind playing, though it is a 5-drop, so you can't put too many of them in your deck. So it's probably just going to be a C+ level card. Next up is Warded Battlements. I think this card's like a D-, maybe even just an F. A 3 mana 0/3 is just not good enough stats in Modern Limited, and it doesn't really help you get onto the attack because a lot of the things, it looks like, oh, if I'm aggressive, this will be like an anthem for my deck. But the problem is a 3 mana 0/3 really takes the foot off of the gas, and you'd rather just have another creature. So if your opponent kills your 2-drop, your Warded Battlements does like your Warded Battlements could be a card on its own. So like, imagine this card as you have this in your opening hand, you want to go 2-drop, 3-drop, keep the pressure up, but instead you go 2-drop, 3-drop, your opponent kills your 2-drop, and all of a sudden you're left with an 0/3 and you have no pressure on the board. So I think Warded Battlements is going to be a D- or maybe just a straight up F because it's just not the ideal card. Next up, we're going to be talking about the blue cards. Oh wait, never mind. We have top 3 white commons here, just to re-emphasize in your mind. Swift Response at number 1, Gale Super at number 2, and Bazoo's Acolyte at number 3. I think these cards are all going to be great. I will note that Gale Super and Bazoo's Acolyte both suffer from the fact that they're 4-drops because you can't have too many 4-drops in your limited deck, especially the aggressive decks that Gale Super and Acolyte are going to thrive in. But I will say that I think they're both going to be very high quality cards, and they're going to be cards that you're looking to get. So I'm going to start with them at the number 3, as the top 3, but keep in mind that you don't want too many 4-drops in your deck. Next up, we're going to be talking about the blue cards. Next up, we have the blue cards, kicking things off with Cancel. Cancel is generally just a D+ or C- level card. It's just not very a high priority. It is oftentimes good as a sideboard card if your opponent has a bomb rare that you can't beat otherwise, but overall, not a high priority pick. Capture Sphere, on the other hand, is generally a pretty good card in blue decks. It almost cracked the top 3 blue commons, but I was kind of warned away by my past self telling me like Capture Sphere always kind of underperforms my expectations. Generally, it's a pretty good card, though. It's a removal spell for blue. It's going to be a C+ in most blue decks because you just need the interactive spell, and Capture Sphere can get the job done. It's not the most efficient. It's not the most unconditional removal, but blue doesn't really get that, and Capture Sphere does the job pretty adequately. So I think it's a C+. It's almost a top 3 common for blue, but I think that there are going to be ways to punish it that make it a little bit worse than it would be in a vacuum. Next is Frantic Inventory. It's a functional reprint of Take Inventory, except it is instant, which is quite nice. Take Inventory was a card from Eldritch Moon that was pretty cool and constructed, but basically in Frantic Inventory is going to be one of those cards where the first copy is not a super high priority, but if you can like pick one up for free, then if you end up with like 3 of them or 4 of them, it can be an okay card. I'm going to start off with it being a D and not really worth the effort, but I'm sure there's going to be some sweet highlight moments, and it might overperform my expectations, especially if it is a card that nobody goes for. Then you can end up with like 4 or 5 and just kind of take over the game with Frantic Inventory control. I can't wait to see it, but I'm going to start off with it not being a very good card. Next up is Frost Breath. This card is probably just a straight up F. Not really efficient enough. 3 mana to tap 2 creatures. Not only do you go down a card, but you're spending 3 mana. It is the type of card that can do some work and can do some things, so it's probably more of like a D or D- than a straight up F, but it's not the type of card that you're going to generally want in your limited deck. The best use case for it, though, is to do it on their upkeep, because then you tap 2 creatures, or pre-combat, right before they go to combat, because you tap 2 creatures, then those creatures don't get to attack, they then don't untap on the next turn, so you really need to leverage the fact that Frost Breath is an instant to get the most value out of it, that you can just, of course, top deck it, tap their 2 last blockers, hit them for lethal damage. That's going to be something that happens from time to time, but overall, don't think it's going to be played very heavily, and I don't think you should be playing it in your deck, because it puts you down a card, and if you don't already have a commanding board position, you're going to just lose the game by falling too far behind on card advantage and on board. Next up is Keen Glidemaster. This is definitely a C or maybe even a C+. It would be the activated ability is pretty expensive, but I can totally imagine in like a blue-green deck, giving one of your big green creatures flying is going to be super powerful, and also just a 2-mana 2/1 that can give flying to itself is quite nice as well. So I think this card is probably going to be a C because the activated ability is a bit expensive, and a 2/1 is a little bit vulnerable, but I think this card is going to be on the upper end of the C range, just barely outside of C+, and maybe I could just give it a C+ for the lols, but I think Keen Glidemaster is going to be a good card, and it's a pretty solid 2-drop. Next up is Library Larcenist, and I think this card is going to be a little bit overrated. I think it's probably a C- just because a 3-mana 1/2 is pretty slow, but there are synergies that you can put in your deck to make this card better. If you can consistently hit them with it every turn, it can be a game plan in and of itself. The problem becomes if you fall behind early, Library Larcenist is a miserable card. It doesn't block well, and it'll just suicide into one of their 2/2s, and overall you're just going to be like 3-mana cantrip. That being said, that is the lowest it can be, is pretty much a 3-mana cantrip. That is a delay on the card draw, so I think a C- is about as low as I can go for it, because that's the base, but it definitely can carry games on its own. It just generally, I don't like counting on cards that are going to sometimes be great and a lot of the time be very mediocre blockers, because if you're behind, this card does not do what you want. So I think Library Larcenist is a C-, though in the right deck where you can give it flying with maybe a Keen Glidemaster or things like that, it can go up to a C or even a little bit higher. So definitely keep in mind, analysis is important. If you have a deck where Library Larcenist is going to be good, maybe you have a lot of 2-drops where you're not going to fall behind early, Library Arsonist can be a win condition for certain types of decks, especially if you can give it evasion. Next up is Lofty Denial. I'm going to start off pretty low on this card because 2 mana for a 4 spike is not great. If you do have a flyer, it becomes basically a hard counter. Adding 4 to a lot of spells is going to be prohibitively expensive, but it's going to be really punishing if you only have it as a 4 spike, you hold it up, and your opponent doesn't play into it. It's going to be more powerful early in the format when people don't play around it, but I think Lofty Denial overall is going to be like a D+, but it can get bumped up to like a C if you have like 5 or 6 flyers in your deck. So Lofty Denial, definitely more of a build around than a conventional card because it does get a massive power boost if you have a flyer in play. That being said, I'm not going to commit to this card early on in my draft, and I think that it'll be the type of card that you end up getting if you have flyers rather than, oh, I'm going to take Lofty Denial and then get flyers. Next up is Mistral Singer. I have this as the number 2 blue common because I think that prowess decks are going to be pretty good in this format. There's a lot of support for them in the blue-red color combination specifically. Also, blue-white has a flying theme, so the flying matters for that. And a 3 mana 2/2 flyer is never bad, but Mistral Singer can move into a top common range because prowess means that you're going to be hitting them for 3 a lot of the time. So it's really like a 2.5 powered flyer, or sometimes even depending on your deck, it could be a 3/2 flyer a lot of the time, kind of like base, or 3/3 flyer in a lot of your situations when you're on offense. It makes it difficult for your opponent to attack into you because you can sometimes like threaten having multiple spells, things like that. It's very difficult to block. So I think Mistral Singer gets that little bump up, and I think it's going to be probably a C+ card, but in the right deck, it could definitely get into B- range. Definitely a potent option. Combines really well with the next card, which is Opt. I think Opt is probably just a C in this format. A lot of the time, Opt is going to be very format dependent, but it looks like there's a Prowess deck, a Spells Matters deck, and Opt is a really good card in that deck. So in that deck, Opt is a C, or maybe even a C+. In other decks that don't care about spells, Opt is like a D+, because it does just spin your wheels. Opt does get better if you have a really powerful card to dig to, like a Bomb Rare, because then you have a higher likelihood of drawing it, but a lot of the time, it'll be too low impact to be worth a slot. So it's never going to be unplayable. It's probably just a C- at worst, D+ in certain decks, but it can overperform. So I think I'm going to start taking it as if it's a C, and then in certain decks that I have, it'll overperform and be a pretty great card. Next up is Read the Tides. This card is very interesting because it gives you some powerful options, because if you already have cards in hand, you can use Read the Tides as a powerful bounce spell, as a tempo play. You can bounce your own creatures, which is really important to keep in mind if your opponent has put one of your creatures under a capture sphere, or has done something to one of your creatures that incapacitates it in some way. You can use Read the Tides to get it back, and then bounce one of their creatures. You can also just bounce two of their creatures for a big tempo play, hit them with your ground creatures that now have open lanes of attack, or you can just draw 3 cards if it's a top deck war and you just need more resources. So I think Read the Tides is going to be pretty good. I'm going to start off with it at a C, because 6 mana is a lot. But it could definitely be the type of card that just is completely backbreaking. So I think you'll definitely want to try. I'm going to, at least in my first few drafts of the format, try to have at least 1 copy in my blue decks. But I think the second copy does get a lot worse, because if you draw 2 of these in your opening hand, you basically are committing to have like very like do nothing type hand for a while. So I think the second copy gets a lot worse. But like it could be like first copy C+, second copy C-. But I'm a little bit hesitant because 6 mana is a lot. So I think I'm going to start out with C, and we'll see where it goes from there. Roaming Ghostlight is next, and I think this is the best blue common. 5 mana for a 3/2 flyer might seem expensive, but when you bounce one of their creatures, it is super potent. So you just basically remove one of their turns. If they just played a 4-drop, you can bounce that, and then you have a nice little threat of your own. Really good in the flyers decks, really good in just tempo-y decks, and overall just a fantastic card. You can also return one of your creatures, which is great. If for the same reasons that returning a creature to your hand with Read the Tides would be good. So in certain cases, you'll want to do that. Keep that in mind. And I think Roaming Ghostlight is going to be fantastic. I have it as the best blue common. I think it's a B- or maybe even a B, depending on how it lines up with the format. The fact that Shock is a removal spell in this format does make it a little bit worse, because it can just, your 5-drop can be killed for 1 mana, but you do get a lot of tempo and you don't fall too far behind because you did just bounce their creature. So I think this is going to be a B- level card. Next up is it's just a really good card. Next up is Rookie Mistake. I don't think this card's very good. It's just really finicky, hard to get working. Because it doesn't buff the power of your creatures, and a lot of the time blue cards kind of suffer from not having high power anyway. Like you'll have a wall on the ground that's like a 2/5 or a 2/4 or something like that, or 1/3, things like that. You're not going to get as much since you don't get a power boost. It's going to be hard to make this like your creatures trade in combat sometimes, but I think Rookie Mistake is probably just a D or a D-. It's just not a very good card. Next up is Arousing Read. This is a very interesting card. I think it's going to be one of the better blue commons. I think it might even be it's going to be like C+ B- range, depending on the synergies in your deck. If you have big creatures that you want to get flying to, it gets a lot better. A lot of the time, though, it is a risky card to play. If your creatures already have flying, it gets a little bit worse because you don't care about the flying then. But I think it's a really good card and a really interesting one. It's probably a C+ or B-. I have it as the number 3 blue common, right behind the Mistral Singer, but I definitely think it could be it has a lot of potential, so I'm really interested to play with this card. I think one of the key things to do with it is to give your big green creatures flying, which is going to be really nice, like giving a Colossal Dreadmaw or something, which is a 6/6 trample for 6. Flying is going to be great. Giving even a 4/4 flying and turning that into a 5/5 flyer is going to be a really potent threat. And draw 2, discard a card means that if you can land this aura, you don't go down cards, which is really important for auras, because then you're not going to lose value. And draw 2, discard a card is definitely better than draw a card. So Rousing Read definitely gets a bump for that, and I think it's going to be a pretty powerful card, especially when combined with the next card. These blue cards really lined up well in terms of alphabetical order, being a good indicator of what to do with them, because like Mistral Singer is a good combo with Opt, Rousing Read is a great combo with Spined Megalodon, because that is a game-ending combo, because Spined Megalodon, 7 mana, hexproof creature, when it attacks you scry, so it's a very powerful threat in that way. And it's going to, first of all, you play it, it stabilizes the board immediately, and then you start attacking with it. If you have any ways of bouncing their creatures, if you have any ways of giving it evasion, there are multiple ways to give Spined Megalodon flying that we've seen already. Rousing Read and the 2/1 that gives flying are both going to be good combos with the Megalodon, and you just hit them, scry, make sure you find gas, and Megalodon is going to be fantastic. I think Rousing Read plus Megalodon is definitely going to be a combo that you are going to see a lot in this format, and if your opponent plays Megalodon, you kind of might want to assume that they have Rousing Read or something to give it flying coming, thing. So try to end the game as quickly as possible. Maybe suicide a creature into it to get them into lethal burn range or something like that for maybe a future top decks, because Megalodon is going to end a lot of games. I think this card is going to be a C, though. I mean, all this analysis, and it's a C. This is why I like to give I don't always love giving a grade, but I think the reason you don't necessarily give Spine Megalodon an insane grade is because a lot of decks aren't going to want a 7-drop control finisher. But in your control deck, it's going to be a great card. It'll even be bumped up to a C+, because you're really going to want to have access to a Spine Megalodon in your control deck. But in a lot of decks, it's just like a D, because you don't want a 7-drop in a lot of limited decks. So Spine Megalodon, I'm going to start with a C, but keep in mind that in a control deck, it's a really important finisher if you don't already have one, and in your aggressive decks, you're not really going to want it. So Spine Megalodon, definitely a sweet card. Next up is Teferi's Protege. Yeah, those are just fun ways of pronouncing prodigy if you are ever looking for one. But yeah, this is a pretty solid card. 3 mana for a 2/3 that you can then loot with is a nice card. 2/3 definitely needs a little bit of help to be a reasonable creature, and giving it a looting ability is nice. Even though the looting ability costs mana, I still think this card's going to be good. I'm going to give it a C, but it can definitely be a C+ if you don't have ways to spend mana in the late game. I do think blue decks oftentimes are going to have ways to spend mana, be that with a Spined Megalodon or with a Read the Tides, but I think Teferi's Prodigy is just going to be a pretty good card. It could even be a C+ in the right decks if you really need that looting, or depending on how good looting ends up being. Looting generally ends up being better if there's not a ton of mana sinks in the format, and it looks like there's a decent amount. There's some pretty expensive cards in blue. There's some good decent card draw in blue, and there's things like Rousing Read where you can discard extra lands as well, which all make Teferi's Prodigy a little bit worse. But I think the card is still going to be solid and a rock solid C in your deck. Next up is Tome Anima. This card is a nice combo with things like the Teferi's Protege, because it can get unblockable because of them. That being said, a 4-mana 3/3 is not really where I want to be. A lot of the time, the blue tempo cards don't end up being as good as they look. It will definitely have a home in certain decks, specifically the prowess aggressive decks that maybe be blue-red are going to want Tome Anima a lot more. Because on your turn it's relatively easy to make this unblockable. You just need like an opt or something like that. But a 4-mana 3/3 is not great in a deck that's trying to block. So I think Tome Anima is probably just a C- or a D+. It's a C- if you're in a deck that is able to draw 2 cards on its turn and cares about attacking, but I don't think those decks are going to come up as often, so it's mostly going to be a D+. Next up is Vidalia Arcanist. I almost had this card in the top 3 blue commons, because in Dominaria this card was actually quite good, even though it wasn't a top 3 blue common in Dominaria. This is a core set, which is less powerful than Dominaria, but I do think Vidalia Arcanist is not as good as it was the last time we saw it, because in Dominaria there was Divination, Blink of an Eye, there was and Syncopate, which were all 3 commons that were very good with the extra mana you got from Arcanist, and it was a wizard for those sorts of synergies. So don't be fooled by the fact that Arcanist was good in Dominaria and think it's immediately great here. It is still a good card, because a 2-mana 1/3 with this extra upside is still going to be good, but I don't think it's as potent. I think it's a C in the set, probably a C- in a lot of decks, but in the decks that have a few instants or sorceries, maybe the Read the Tides, the 6-mana card, Vidalia Arcanist gets a little bit better, but keep in mind that it's not going to be as potent as it was last time around, so I think it is just a C. Not a card you're going to take insanely highly, but it's definitely going to be a card that pulls its weight, stalls the ground for your Flyers decks, to get some extra mana for some of your more controlling decks, and I think it is going to be a role player in the format, just not as good as it was last time we saw it. Next up is Wall of Runes. This card's pretty much unplayable. I'm going to give this card an F. I don't love 0-powered walls. I think it's actually probably a D-, but I'm just going to take a stricter stance on it, because there's really... the cutoff for a 0-powered creature is really tricky, because if it has even a single power, your opponent can no longer attack like 2 1/1s into it to force through damage. But if you have an 0/4, they can go wide past it so easily that it doesn't make it an ideal blocker. Sure, you might have some Flyers decks where it's fringe playable, so I'm just going to actually bump it up to a D- or a D, probably just a D-, but this type of effect is generally not going to be worth it in Limited. An 0/4 just does so little in the middle stages of the game or the late stages of the game. You're never going to have like a deck that's so focused that you're like, well, I'm always winning with flying, so my 0/4 wall is all that I need. It's just not a card that you're really going to want. You'd rather have a Vidalia Arcanist that can actually trade with creatures or participate in double blocks and triple blocks and be effective in that way. So I think Wall of Runes pretty much a unplayable card. That was my experience with it last time it was around, and that's going to be I'm assuming the experience this time around as well. Finally is Wishcoin Crab. This is an interesting one, because in the set that it was in, which was Guilds of Ravnica, that was the last time we saw it, I think. It might have been in something since then, but I remember it from Guilds of Ravnica. It actually did a lot of work because it lined up really well with the format. There was a lot of 4-powered creatures that Wishcoin Crab blocked well. There was a lot of 2-toughness creatures that it could kill, and so I think Wishcoin Crab is going to be one of the most format-dependent cards. It really does depend on how it lines up. I'm going to start out thinking of Wishcoin Crab as a C- / D+ level card, one that I'm not super thrilled to put in my deck because it doesn't have an inherently high amount of power, but but I could easily see it moving up to C level depending on how it interacts with the format. The fact that Colossal Dreadmaw is a big green creature in the format does make Wishcoin Crab worse, but if it interacts well against the other big cards from the other colors, like if all of the black cards are playing a 4-powered creature, or if all the red decks are playing 4-powered creatures, Wishcoin Crab can do a lot of work. And so I'm going to withhold a verdict on this card until I see how it lines up against the format, because a 4-mana 2/5 can sometimes be great and sometimes be like very bad depending on how things line up in the format, and it really is context dependent. I'm going to start out with it being a C- or D+. In your Flyers decks, you are going to want ways to hold the ground, and this will do an admirable job, hopefully, but we will just have to wait and see. That's going to do it for the blue cards. Just a quick reminder on the top 3 commons I have: Roaming Ghostlight, Mistral Singer. Mistral Singer. If I said Slinger, I missaid it, so I'm sure everyone in the comments was already roasting me for that one, but Mistral Singer and Arousing Read. I think those cards are all going to be quite good. I think they could all definitely approach. I think Roaming Ghostlight is in the B range. Mistral Singer and Arousing Read can definitely approach the B range in the right deck, and I think that blue does have a lot of interesting and powerful synergistic options to explore in this format. That's going to do it for blue, and I will see you discussing the black cards next. Moving on, we have the black cards, starting things off with Alchemist's Gift. This is a combat trick that I don't think is going to be very good. +1/+1 generally isn't enough to wildly swing a combat, and while Death Touch or Lifelink can swing the course of a game, it doesn't like stick around. It's not like an enchantment that gives your creature lifelink forever, so I think this card is going to be a D-, just very inflexible combat trick. Sometimes you'll have to play it so that you can 2-for-1 yourself to kill a big creature with Death Touch, but even though it's relatively flexible, I just don't think it does enough, has too low of a power to be worth a slot in your deck. Next is Blood Glutton. This card seems like a C- level card. It's the type of thing where at the top end of your deck or as a sideboard card against aggro, it's just like really irritating, but it does die to a lot of the removal in the set, and overall, I think that a 5-mana 4/3 lifelink is just a little bit too small, so probably more of a D+ than a C-. Just not going to be super happy to play this card, but just it's a playable card in a pinch. And it is like not unreasonable to side this in against aggro where you just need some life gain. Next is Cage Zombie. I think this is a C-. The ability is somewhat relevant, and it definitely can do some effectual things. If you have the need for, like, if you're going to be stalling the game out, if you're going to be trading creatures, this card's going to get some extra damage in, and like getting that 2 life is definitely not nothing. A 3-mana 2/3 doesn't need all that much to be a effectual card, and so I think this is a C-. Just sometimes it'll be relevant, and oftentimes it won't make the cut. Next up is Crypt Lurker. This is a 4-mana 3/4, which is generally just a solid body, and then it just gives you a lot of extra upside. Sacrificing a creature is actually quite good because sometimes your creature will be just not useful anymore. Like it'll be a 2/2 in the late game and you'll just sacrifice it to get some value, or you'll sack a creature that has some sort of death trigger, or you'll sack a creature that's under a capture sphere. So I think Crypt Lurker is going to be pretty good. Definitely just a rock solid C, and randomly just being able to discard your ineffectual creatures is also nice, though mostly you're going to use the sacrifice ability, I think. So yeah, Crypt Lurker going to be a C in my opinion. Next up is Deathbloom Thallid. I think this is just a C+. Very effective creature. 3-mana 3/2 that dies into a 1/1 is just a good body, good stats. I have this as the 3rd best black common. You're never going to be unhappy playing this card, and it's always going to be rock solid. Next is Duress. This is strictly a sideboard card. The odds of it whiffing are just too high to be worth playing in the main deck, and it's even a kind of fringe sideboard card because if you whiff on it, it feels so bad. But if you've seen a few expensive removal spells, or maybe a bomb, instant or sorcery or enchantment, that type of thing, then you can bring in Duress and have it do good work, but I think it's more of a sideboard card than anything. Next up is Fetid Imp. This card is okay. It can help you trigger flying synergies in a deck that's maybe less conventional. The Death Touch can be relevant, but overall, mostly just like a kind of inefficiently costed flyer. So I think it's a C-. Death Touch means that it's never going to be too unplayable, but I think it's not really a premium card. So C- for this good one. Finishing blow I have as the 2nd best black common. Destroy a creature. Planeswalker is not really relevant in limited, but for 5 mana, it's just a good rate. If in just limited in general, you're going to be pretty happy playing this for 5 mana, and it's just going to be a B- rock solid removal spell. Next up is Gloomsower. This one is quite expensive, 7 mana for an 8/6 that it has some incentive against being chump blocked, but that being said, it's still a 7 mana card. A lot of decks aren't going to want that, and I think it's probably just a D+. Some decks are going to want an expensive finisher, and Gloomsower can fill that role, but most decks are going to be fine just leaving this one on the sidelines, especially for the more aggressive decks that are more about playing cheap spells. So I think this is just a D level card. and maybe goes up to D+ if you need a finisher for a control deck. Next up, we have Grasp of Darkness, which is a fantastic common, definitely the best black common. I think this is just a straight up B. In limited, 2 mana, to give a creature -4/-4, basically kills everything you care about. This set also has some like relatively small stats, so I was looking at some numbers, and it kills like 88% of creatures at the common and uncommon level, or something crazy like that, which is very, very good for a removal spell that only costs 2 mana. So Grasp of Darkness is definitely premium. You're going to want to take this highly, and it's a great incentive to be black. One thing I will note is that even though it is double black, it doesn't really get a huge deduction for that, because Grasp of Darkness is not the sort of removal spell that you're often firing at their 2-drop. One of the things with certain 2-mana removal spells, like something like Sorin's Thirst, which is black to deal 2 damage, gain 2 life, is that you pretty much want to be able to use it to kill their 2-drop if you're on the draw. But Grasp of Darkness is the type of thing that can kill their 4-drops or even their 5-drops sometimes, so you're oftentimes going to want to save it, which means that it being double black and harder to cast in the early game doesn't hurt it as much, though that is still definitely a knock against it. Next up is Infernal Scarring, which is probably just a D, or a D- even. It's just very, very fringe playable. It doesn't really do what you want to do. In a lot of cases, you can get blown out by them just bouncing the creature, them putting a capture sphere on the creature, and overall Infernal Scarring is best left avoided. Next up is Liliana's Steward. This one's also probably best left avoided. Just a 1-mana 1/2 that just has a very marginal ability to make them discard. You can't even make them discard on draw step, so you lose out on that ability, which is also a factor, because if you're doing it during the draw step, you could at least make them, like, if you were in a top deck war, you could make them discard the card they drew before they could cast it. But since you can't do that because you can only do it at sorcery speed, this card is just an F. I think it's just straight up unplayable. Next up is Masked Blackguard. A 2-mana 2/1 flash is still, even with an activated ability, is often just a 2-mana 2/1. This is just going to be a C-. It's a 2-drop that you can play. It'll be fine. It has some relevance because of its pump ability, but because it only has 1 toughness, you have to pump like 2 times before it can get out of trading with a 2-drop most of the time. So generally just going to be a C-. Not a super premium 2-drop, but definitely one you can play. Next is Mind Rot. This card is pretty format dependent as well. Sometimes Mind Rot is more playable than other times, but it's generally not a super high priority, though it is a pretty good sideboard card against decks that are going to have more expensive cards. So by the time they're casting their 6-drop, maybe they only have 1 or 2 cards in hand, and you can bring in Mind Rot to make them discard those cards. So I think this is mostly going to be either a sideboard card or just a D+ level card in limited. Next up is Rise Again. This is a common, which usually would be an uncommon. It's returning a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield. There's not cycling in this set, so there's not like inherent ways to get big creatures into the graveyard. There are a couple of discard outlets. There are some creatures that discard themselves, but Rise Again is going to be one of those ones that is very format dependent on how the creatures end up lining up. I'm going to start off with it being a D because it is very clunky and there's not like inherently ways to get creatures in the graveyard. But if you end up in a certain deck archetype, there might be certain ways to mill. So for example, the blue common that we looked at earlier, the 3-drop that can loot, you can draw a card, discard a card, you can discard a big creature and maybe get your mana advantage that way. Maybe even bring back the 7-mana 8/6 type card you have access to at common. But I'm going to start off pretty low on Rise Again and wait to see an archetype emerge. So I'm going to start off with D. Next up is Sanguine Indulgence. This is a pretty cool card. It really does reward you for gaining the life, because if you cast this for only 1 mana, a lot of the time you'll be able to cast one of the cards you got back, whereas if you cast this for 4 mana, you're oftentimes going to have to wait a turn. So that 3 life is actually a big clause, and I think if you can consistently gain 3 or more life in a turn, for example with like lifelink creatures being the best way, Sanguine Indulgence can be like a C+ in your deck. But if you aren't going to be gaining life, then it definitely goes down to probably D+ or D range, because 4 mana to bring back 2 creatures is just super inefficient and also super slow and clunky, because not only does it cost 4 mana, but you have to wait till the stage of the game where you have 2 creatures in the graveyard, which is sometimes unlikely to happen, or the creature gets capture sphered, or like Faith's Fetters, which is an uncommon in this set, and just doesn't go to the graveyard, which is also a problem. And so Sanguine Indulgence can be a really clunky card. So I think if you have ways to gain 3 more life relatively consistently, then the card definitely gets up to maybe a C+ at its best, but most of the time it's going to be a D. Final 3 cards here. Skeleton Archer is great. It's a great way to punish 1 toughness creatures, which is just a key card in this set where there's several 1 toughness creatures that you want to kill. And also, Skeleton Archer just can ping face in a pinch, or it can be used to finish off a creature. So you attack your 2/2 in, they block with their 3/3, Skeleton Archer finishes it off. Skeleton Archer is definitely one you're going to want to consider when your opponent makes a sketchy attack. I think this card's just a C+, definitely a solid black common. Depending on how the format lines up, it could go down to a C, but I don't think it'll ever be above a C+, just because a 4-mana 3/3 with a minor upside is like with this upside that's always going to be somewhat relevant, but vary amounts of relevance is never going to be higher than a C+, but definitely a pretty solid black common. Next up is Village Rites, which is another common I'm super excited to play. I almost had this as one of the top commons, but it does get worse in multiples, but the first copy is definitely something you're going to want to prioritize. Village Rites, essentially the use case for this is you can either block sack, which means your opponent attacks you, you block with a small creature that was going to die anyway, sack it to draw 2 cards. You can also use this to dodge removal spells sometimes, so you play your creature with 1 mana up, your opponent goes for a removal spell on them, and then in response you sack the creature to draw 2 cards, so you not only, like, you basically stop a creature that's going to die anyway, so you draw the 2 cards for essentially without the sacrifice clause, which is super nice. So I think Village Rites, the first copy, is going to always have a use in your deck, always going to have some synergy, and you're going to definitely want that, and you're going to prioritize that at like the C+ level. And then after that, subsequent copies get a lot worse because you're going to not be able to find the situations where you're going to be able to use it as often outside of like a dedicated sacrifice deck, which doesn't seem super likely to come up. So I think the second copy is probably a C-, and then they get subsequently worse from there. So Village Rites, definitely the first copy is one I'm looking to play. And finally, Walking Corpse, 2 mana, 2/2, no upside. There might be some zombie synergies with some rares. I'm not sure on that one, but basically it's just going to be a D+ level card. Hopefully you don't have to play it, but you can just play it for curve filler, and it's not going to be the end of the world. That's going to do it for the black cards. Just want to remind you the top 3 black cards. Grasp of Darkness, Finishing Blow, and Deathbloom Thallid are all super powerful. Obviously, Grasp of Darkness is fantastic removal, Finishing Blow also good removal, and then Deathbloom Thallid, a rock-solid creature. That's going to do it for the black cards, and we are going to be talking about the red ones next, and red has some spicy ones. Next up, we have red, starting things off with Bone Pit Brute. I think this card is going to be a D+. It is quite expensive, but having Menace is a nice upside, and giving a creature +4/+0 will facilitate some nice trades, or push through a lot of extra damage if you use it on a flyer, so I do think it has some potential at the top end of a deck. That being said, 6-drops are not premium in most red decks, so I think it could just be a card that you don't mind leaving at home. Next up is Burn Bright. Unfortunately, not a super good card. Go Wide is not really a supported archetype in this set, though there are a couple of cards that could potentially help you go wide with Burn Bright, so I'm not going to call it unplayable, but it's only going to find a home in specific decks, maybe using some of the token generators in red and white, but mostly it's just going to be a card that you don't play. So it's kind of like a build around C, because in certain decks it's going to be quite good, but in most decks it's going to be unplayable. Next is Chandra's Magma. This is a C+ level 2-drop. It's really quite good because on turn 2 it can start hitting them for 2 if you play it then, and then in the late part of the game it can start pinging the opponent and still getting in for 1 damage, which really means it has to be dealt with, which is quite powerful for a 2-drop. It almost cracked the top 3, but red does have so many powerful commons that it fell just short. But definitely a high priority pick and one of the better 2-drops available in the format at the common level. Next is Crash Through. This card is going to be a D, though there are some red-blue spells decks or prowess decks that may want to prioritize this a little bit higher to trigger all their prowess cards at relatively low cost. So if you're in those decks, you can probably pick these up pretty late and you'll run them and be pretty happy with them. Otherwise, it's just a D, not really a card that's going to provide you a ton of value. Next is Destructive Tampering. Strictly a sideboard card for if you see a really powerful artifact you have to stop, and then sometimes in those sideboarded games it'll have the extra upside of preventing creatures from blocking, but not something that I'm going to be main decking. Next is Furor of the Bitten. This card is going to be a D. I mean, there are going to be some decks where they just go all in with their Furors and they attack you to death and you get wrecked, but then there are going to be other times where they go for the Furor of the Bitten, and then in response you get like Grasp of Darkness or Scorching Dragonfire, or the creature gets killed in response, or bounced or something, and Furor looks terrible. So I think this card's going to be a D, not really worth the risk, though sometimes decks could go all in and have it work out for them. Next is Goblin Arsonist. I think this card is more of a sideboard card than a main deck card. A 1-mana 1/1 that like doesn't really pump stats is not going to be great. Sure, it can ping the opponent if it dies, so maybe it works with some sacrifice stuff to kill X1s, but I think it's really going to thrive as a sideboard card if you see a couple of creatures that have 1 toughness from the opponent, because then this card becomes really annoying because it can chump block and ping something, or you can sacrifice it to something to kill a creature. And in those situations, it does become a lot better. So I think Goblin Arsonist is going to be a sideboard card, not really one I'm happy to main deck. If I was to main deck it, it would probably be like a D, because it does trade with a 2 toughness creature on defense or on offense if they block it with that, but a lot of the time it's going to be better relegated to the sideboard. Next up is Goblin Wizardry. This is one of the tokens that I was thinking of when I was thinking of Burn Bright, and this one actually looks pretty powerful. Getting 2 prowess cards at instant speed is really nice. The prowess buffs are really nice the more prowess creatures you have, so all of a sudden your Crash Through is giving +2/+2 worth of stats instead of just +1/+1 worth of stats. So Goblin Wizardry is one that I'm really excited to try out. I think it's going to be a C in a lot of decks that have like a medium number of instants and sorceries. If you have very few instants and sorceries, it's going to be like a D, but if you have a lot, it could go all the way up to like C+ and be a really powerful card in your deck. So this one's a very variable card because it really does depend on how many instants and sorceries you have in your deck, how many opts, crash throughs, those types of cards you're running. But in the right deck, I could definitely see it being a potent card and one of your better cards at common. Next is Hobble Fiend. This is going to be a rock solid C. It's a 2-drop that has additional upside by being able to sack some of your less relevant creatures, or sometimes you can like go for a big attack, your opponent blocks one of your creatures, and then you sack them all and put the counters on your Hobble Fiend. It just has threat of activation, that type of thing. That being said, there's not a ton of great sacrifice fodder, so it's not like it's overwhelmingly good. It's just going to be a solid role player in the format. I think it's going to be a C. Next is Igneous Kur. This card is a D+ generally. It's not a super premium 2-drop. It's generally best if left at home because the activated ability in order to trade for anything is prohibitively expensive generally. But there is a card in the set that searches for Igneous Kur, or the Alpine guide. I think it's the white 2-drop dog that we looked at earlier, and that card will make you want to play Igneous Kur a little bit more. But generally it's going to be a D level 2-drop, but it does get a little bit better if you have that uncommon. Next is Onake Ogre. This card is just a C-, a 4/2 for 3, hits pretty hard. Sometimes it trades for a 2-drop, sometimes it trades for a 4-drop. It's just one of those cards that pretty standard to see this one, and it's just generally a little bit below what you'd be happy playing, but it's definitely a rock solid card to play in your deck if you need to. Maybe not rock solid, maybe more like whatever is slightly less hard than rock, like wood solid. I don't think that's a saying, but yeah, whatever is slightly less hard than rock. So yeah, it's a C-, I think. Pittsburgh Devils is next. I think this card's going to vary from C to C+, depending on how things line up in the format. It does die to a lot of the removal, and some of the removal does exile, which is a lot worse for Pittsburgh Devils. There is some sacrifice things which could make it a little bit better to help avoid that type of removal. So I think it's probably going to end up at C+, but you don't generally need to prioritize your 5-drops in red decks, but I think Pittsburgh Devils is definitely a great card, and the fact that it can deal the damage to any target means that if your opponent gets to a low life total, your Pittsburgh Devils becomes quite threatening. Next up, all in a row, we have the top 3 red commons, in my opinion, in order: Scorching Dragonfire, Shock, and Spellgorger Weird. Scorching Dragonfire, super efficient, kills a ton of the creatures in this format because a lot of them are relatively small, and it even exiles them for that extra value. Definitely a powerful card. It's going to probably be a B in this format. Just kills so many of the creatures. Next is Shock. The first copy of Shock is generally going to be a B-, just generally very efficient removal spell. It does get worse in multiples because you run out of targets, but the first copy of Shock is going to definitely find a target, can even go face in a pinch, and I think Shock is definitely quite potent, and definitely one you're going to want to prioritize the first copy of. If you do prioritize multiple copies of it and you're playing a control deck, you can sometimes even choose to be on the draw, because Shock is the type of card that gets better on the draw, because then on turn 1 your opponent plays land, you play a land, turn 2 they play their 2-drop, and then on their end step you get to shock their 2-drop a lot of the time, which then leaves you free to play your 2-drop on an empty board. You have that extra card, and your Shock has done a lot of work. Next up is Spellgorger Weird. This card is fantastic. In War of the Spark, it was really good. It really surprised a lot of people, and I'm not going to fall for the trick of underrating it. Again, this card just grows really quickly. It triggers off of any non-creature spell, not just instants and sorceries, which means your random enchantments, your random artifacts that are non-creature are also going to trigger this, which is quite nice. And overall, Spellgorger Weird starts off as a 3-mana 2/2, but can quickly grow to a 3-mana 5/5 and things like that, especially since a lot of the best red commons are things like Shock, Scorching Dragonfire, other removal spells that just will naturally grow the Spellgorger Weird. In a typical limited deck, you're oftentimes going to have like something like 15 creatures and 8 non-creatures, which means Spellgorger Weird is naturally going to be able to grow. And I think this card, in a dedicated deck, is like game winning, and in most decks is just going to be very solid, that grows consistently. So I think Spellgorger Weird is fantastic and definitely worthy of a B- or even C+ or even B- level grade in the right deck. So I think the card is definitely a high pick and one worth building around. Next up is Sure Strike. This card is generally a good performer in the combat trick department. Definitely just a C- though. You don't really need to prioritize combat tricks, but if you want one, Sure Strike is a good one to get the job done. Always going to win you the combat pretty much, and just make sure you don't get blown out by instant speed removal. Next is Thrill of Possibility. This card was actually very good in Theros Beyond Death, but I think that was mostly because of the graveyard synergies, so I don't think I'm going to start off very high on this one. I'm going to start with it at D. You might play it if you care about casting non-creature spells for a prowess deck or something like that, but overall I think Thrill of Possibility is just going to be a D level card that you can put in sometimes, but it's like the definition of D. You're not going to be too sad if it stays on the sidelines. Next is Turn to Slag. This almost made it into the top 3 commons as well, but 5 mana to deal 5 is not as premium as the other removal we get these days, so Turn to Slag, definitely just going to slot into most decks. One you're going to be happy playing a copy of, but multiple copies can get a little bit clunky. It's just a C+ level card though, definitely better than replacement level, better than like most mediocre creatures, but you'll probably still take, I think it's probably a 5th best red common after the Magmut even, the 2-drop that can ping them, so I think Turn to Slag is definitely a good one, and one that you will see a lot of. But it doesn't kill everything for 5 mana, which is why it doesn't make it into the top 3 commons, just a C+ level. Next up is Turret Ogre. I think this is just a definition of a C. It has some reach to help you against the flyers. It's going to get 2 extra damage done if you have something like an Onake Ogre leading into it. And overall, Turret Ogre is just going to be a rock-solid card. Please don't run your creatures into this. This always happens. Turret Ogre has reach. It has reach. It has reach. Just gotta re-emphasize that because it always gets people, and it's just a real feels bad when you run your 2/2 flyer into the Ogre. But yeah, just a rock-solid card. Definitely pretty much the definition of a C, and one that you'll be seeing a lot of. That's going to do it for the red cards. Just a quick reminder, the top three red cards are Scorching Dragonfire, Shock, and Spellgorger Weird. The Chandra's Magmut and the Slag, whatever it's called, the Turn to Slag, are also quite good. But yeah, that's going to do it for the red cards, and I'll see you for the green cards. Moving on to the green cards, we're going to start things off with Colossal Dreadmaw. He's back. He's better than ever. Or maybe not better than ever. He's the same as ever, as they say. I think this card is just going to be a rock-solid C, maybe even going up to C+, depending on how the card lines up against the format, but it's never going to be really worse than a C. A 6-mana 6/6 trample is just going to end a lot of games, and you'll play a few of these in your decks if you can get them, and I think they're going to be a pretty solid performer. Next up is Drowsing Tyrannodon. I actually have this as the 3rd best green common, which may be interesting, but I think that it's going to be a gatekeeper that lets you do a lot of other good things in your deck. A 2-mana 3/3 defender would normally be a little bit meh because it can never attack, but this one can attack once you've turned the corner, once you have a Colossal Dreadmaw or something of that nature in play, and it can sometimes even lead to crazy curve outs where you go like turn 2 Tyrannodon into turn 3 Onaki Ogre and you hit them with your 3/3 right away, which is super high upside. And also, a lot of the times in your green decks you can afford to be more defensive because you'll have like 2 or 3 Colossal Dreadmaws in your deck that you just have to survive to land and then battle them through their removal spells and then eventually just win with your big creatures, and your Tyrannodon can then chip in for some damage. So I don't think it's going to matter as much that it can't attack in the early game, and I think this is going to be a C+ level card that you're going to want to get a few copies of in your green decks to really stall out the aggressive decks. Next up is Garruk's Greathorn. This is just a classic D. 5 mana 7/3 is just not great stats. If you need some stuff with high power, this can sometimes do the job pretty well, but overall, not really. 7/3 is just going to oftentimes trade with like a 3-drop, which you don't really want for your 5-drop. Next up is Gnarled Sage, a card I'm a good deal more excited about. I think that the draw 2 archetype for green might be a little bit might be pretty solid, and I think that Gnarled Sage is going to be a really nice player. Being able to attack as a 4/6 Vigilance is really nice because you can start getting in some damage while also holding back all of their creatures, because a 4/4 holds back basically all flyers and a lot of the ground creatures. So I think Gnarled Sage is going to be quite nice. Sometimes you can even draw 2 cards on your opponent's turn with something like a Thrill of Possibility to get that surprise toughness boost, so keep that in mind if you're attacking into a Gnarled Sage against certain deck colors. But yeah, I think this card's going to be pretty solid, and either a C or a C+, depending on how relevant the reach is. I'm going to start out with C+, because I think this is a very solid 5-drop, but again, it's a 5-drop, so it gets a little bit of a knock for that. Next up is Hunter's Edge. This card is fantastic. It's like Hunt the Weak, but without the fighting. It's just like a punch, like a rabbit bite type effect, or a ram through for those that are newer and just played in Ikoria and stuff, because getting a counter and then doing damage is really effective, and it's definitely worth the 4-mana investment. I think this card's going to be a B-. It is a little bit more easily interactable than some of the other premium removal spells for other colors like Grasp of Darkness, but this card is definitely going to be a fantastic addition to all your green decks. You'll take as many copies as you can get, and it's going to be a real key player in this format, and one that you'll definitely want to be careful playing against. If you are playing with this card, try not to run it out if your creature has a good chance of dying. If they've been holding up a black all game, maybe just keep trying to play your other stuff, but at some point you can just go for it and hope for the best. Your opponent's not always going to have it, but definitely a great card in the format. Next is Life Goes On. This card is just unplayable. It's really hard to facilitate the gain 8 life part. Gaining 8 life isn't even really worth a card because you're just putting yourself down a resource. Even out of the sideboard, I don't like this card because there isn't like a ton of like burn decks running around that are just going to be like burning you, and then you gain 8 life and like save yourself from 3 burn spells. They're just going to be hitting you with creatures, and gaining 4 life or 8 life is just going to like buy you maybe a turn or maybe 2 turns at best. So I think Life Goes On isn't really an effective sideboard card and is just an F. Next up is Llanowar Visionary. I actually have this as the 2nd best green common, maybe not controversial at all, because it's a 3-mana 2/2 that draws a card and then can also tap for mana. Like, even just a 3-mana 2/2 draw card would be a very good card, and the fact that it can then ramp you up to your Dreadmaws, your other 5-drops like your Gnarled Sages, is really nice as well. So I think this card is a premium one, definitely a B- level card, very powerful, and definitely a nice pull into the green decks. Next up is Ornery Dilophosaur, which is a very interesting card. 4 mana for a 2/2 Death Touch on its surface is not like the greatest stat line, but the fact that it can then attack makes it a lot scarier because it is hard to block if it's a 4/4, and if you are kind of beating down your opponent, a 4 mana 4 for Death Touch is really hard to deal with. I will also say that on defense, it doesn't matter that it doesn't have the extra power. The toughness, if it was a 2-4, it would be much better on defense, but a 2-2 is going to, Death Touch is going to trade with anything and anyway, so you don't really have to worry about the Dilophosaur on I don't know why I'm struggling with the word. You don't have to worry about the Dilophosaur on defense. On offense, it's going to be a pretty good beater once you've stabilized, which green seems to have pretty good tools for doing, and I think that Dilophosaur is going to be a rock-solid C, maybe even a C+ in the right deck that can trigger it. Next up is Portcullis Vine. This card's interesting because it kind of fits two of the themes of green, which is cards that die and drawing a second card, which could make it a little bit better than it looks. Generally, it's not going to be great because an 0-3 doesn't block a ton of things. Like, sure, it'll block their 2-drops for a little bit. It can sacrifice itself, so it's never going to be that bad, so I think it's probably just a D level card. Sometimes you'll play it if you have enough triggers for it dying, or if you want to draw a second card every turn really badly, and in those cases it will go up in value. Next up is Pride Malkin. This is a nice payoff for the +1/+1 counters decks which might be running around here. Which can be quite nice. It can also like give some of your big creatures trample if they don't have trample already. I think it's going to slot nicely into the green decks, but it's probably still just a C- level card because on its surface is a 3-mana 3/2. If you have extra counter synergies though, it can definitely go up. Next up is Ranger's Guile. This is like a D or D+ level combat trick. +1/+1 is just not great for a combat trick, and holding up Ranger's Guile the whole game to try and protect from a removal spell can be good, depending on what removal your opponent has, but oftentimes it's going to be better to just play out your creatures, play out your curve, and not have to worry about holding up Ranger's Guile the whole game, and just accepting that your creatures are going to die to removal sometimes. So I think the card's probably a D, maybe a D+ if you have certain cards that you really need to protect, but overall not a super high priority combat trick. Next up is Return to Nature. This is a great sideboard card against the enchantments and artifacts, and also random graveyard stuff, but mostly enchantments and artifacts. I don't think there's enough targets for it to be a main deckable card, but definitely a strong sideboard option, and one that you'll take over medium playable. So it's like a sideboard C+, because in certain matchups, it will do a lot of work. Next up is Run Afoul. I don't love this card because making them sack a flyer doesn't really, like, the mana discount you get for this in limited is generally not going to matter as much, and so they'll just sacrifice their worst flyer. If you're playing against a deck where you're bringing this in, they're probably going to have multiple flyers, and then they're just like sacrificing their worst one. So I think Run Afoul is quite bad. You can maybe side it in as like a sideboard D. It'll be like sometimes better than like your worst card in the matchup, like maybe a sideboard D+ or C, like, but generally you're not going to love this card because a lot of the time they'll just have a couple flyers in play if they are a flyers deck. It's not going to be like they tap out for their 5-mana flying bomb and then you make them sacrifice it, though in those cases you do feel pretty smart. So another way you can use this is if your opponent has the like hexproof combo in blue where they play the big hexproof guy and then they give that one flying. That's another way Run Afoul can do work, get around that hexproof. So definitely a sideboard card you can side in, and in certain situations it'll be okay. So probably more like a sideboard C-, but it's not as good as Plummet because you're not going to be casting this on turn 1, and by the time you're casting it you'll have the extra mana available. So don't keep that in mind. Yeah, be sure to keep in mind that it's not as good as Plummet, and you'll bring it in less often than you would bring in a Plummet and take it less highly. Next up is Saber-Tooth Mauler. This is a really good one if you're planning on trading, or if you have some cards that sacrifice themselves, like the Portcullis Vines. 4-mana 4/4 that can slowly grow over the course of the game is quite nice, especially because it will untap, so you can sometimes attack with it, and then if some stuff strays off in combat, it will untap. That being said, a 4-mana 4/4 that slowly grows is not like anything insane, so I think this is mostly going to be a C if you can trigger it a couple times, like if you have a couple sacrifice outlets in your deck to trigger it yourself, and probably a C- otherwise, because there are going to be situations where it's just a 4-mana 3/3 because you aren't able to like trade off in combat. Though I feel like most of the time you're going to be able to trade off on the first time, so it's probably just a C. Rock solid card, and one that you're going to be playing playing against a lot of the time. Next up is Citizen Training. It gives trample to your big creatures. It draws you a second card for the things that care about that, and I think this is overall going to be pretty good. It's not going to be as good as it was in Theros Beyond Death because there's no Constellation to trigger, but overall I think this card's still going to be good. Probably just a C- or a C level card, depending on the level of synergy in your deck. Next up is Snare Spinner. I think this card's going to be worse than it was in War of the Spark, which is where we first saw this card, because in War of the Spark you really cared about protecting Planeswalkers, and in this set a 2-mana 1/3 that can like protect your life total isn't going to be as relevant. I think I'd rather have the Saurus, the 2-mana 3/3 that I looked at earlier, the Tyrannodon, the Drowsing Tyrannodon. But Snare Spinner is still going to make your deck a decent amount of the time, and even when it doesn't make your deck, it's going to be a good sideboard card against the flying decks. So probably a like D+ main deck card, and like a good sideboard C for the flying decks. Next up is Titanic Growth, a really good combat trick. as far as combat tricks go. +4/+4 can not only win you a combat, but can also end the game by surprise sometimes. So I think this is just going to be the standard position for combat tricks of this nature, which is a C-. Next up is Track Down. This is an interesting one because it's kind of like Adventurous Impulse. I will also say that the guy in the artwork, this came to my mind, but he looks just like the what's the hunter called in Hearthstone? Rexxar. He looks just like Rexxar from Hearthstone, which is kind of funny. So keep that in mind when you're playing this card. But I don't think it's going to be that good. It reminds me of Adventurous Impulse, which was 1 mana to look at the top 3 for a creature or land. And I think Scry 3 and then reveal the top and draw it is a little bit better in the context of this set, because there are things that care about drawing a second card, like the Gnarled Sage. And Scrying 3 is definitely nice because you can set up multiple draws. But that being said, I still think it's going to be pretty medium. It's probably just going to be a D, maybe goes up to D+ if you have draw 2 card synergies, or you really care about like prowess or something like that, but probably just a D. And it does get a little bit better if you have something really important to dig to, but you can kind of treat this like a bad green version of Anticipate or something like that. Final card for green is Truffle Snout. This card is great, rock solid C. It's either a 3 mana 3/3, which is nice, or a 3 mana 2/2 that gains 4 life, which is really good against the aggressive decks because 4 life attached to something is really nice. So it's not like life goes on where it's just 1 mana gain 4 life. It's a 2/2 that also gains you 4 life, so it can also block, trade, and combat, do all that stuff. So I think Truffle Snout's going to be a great card. Definitely just a rock solid C, and against some of the more aggressive decks, it'll even outperform that. So if aggressive decks are really good in the format, Truffle Snout will get a little bit of a boost and maybe be a C+ even. But yeah, that's going to do it for the green commons. The top 3, as a reminder, are the Hunter's Edge, Llanowar, Visionary, and a Drowsing Tyrannodon, in my opinion, though there are some contenders. Like the Truffle Snout might actually get up there. And what is the other card that might get up there? And there was another card that was in my mind that might grow up there. And Gnarled Sage is also a really good one. So keep those in mind as well when you're drafting your green decks. But green definitely looks like a lot of fun. That can do it for green, and we're just going to finish things off with some artifacts and yeah, some lands. We've reached the final section, which is the lands and colorless cards. Going to start things off real simple with the gain lands. That's Bloodfell Caves, Blossoming Sands, Dismal Backwater, Jungle Hollow, Rugged Highlands, Scoured Barren, Swiftwater Cliffs, Thornwood Falls, Tranquil Cove, Windscarred Crag. Those 10 gain lands are going to be very solid for your decks. They are definitely like C+ level cards. You take them over the average commons if you are those 2 colors. So if you're a green-white deck and you have the choice between Blossoming Sands and an average C level card, take the Blossoming Sands, though you still take the premium cards over it. The reason you do this is because in Limited, you get to play 23 of your cards and then generally 17 lands, and you lose a lot of games to just drawing the wrong colors or getting color screwed in some way, and these lands really help you avoid that issue. They also let you use more of your draft picks. The extra life can be relevant, all sorts of things like that. Even if they were just tap lands without the life, you would still take them pretty highly because losing games to color screw is really bad. It just hurts your win percentage, and having that consistent mana is key. So definitely take these as if they're C+ level cards, and you can also sometimes use them to splash. So if you're a green-red deck and you want to splash white for something, then you can take a Blossoming Sands and use it for that. And also keep in mind that if you take a red-green land, it still helps you splash white because you'll have more sources of your main colors, so you can afford to play more planes. So take those cards as if they're C+ level, and you will not be disappointed. Next up, we have Forgotten Sentinel. Forgotten Sentinel is a pretty potent card because it triggers some of the 4-powered synergy cards, which is pretty nice, and it comes at a very reasonable cost. I don't think it's a great one by any stretch of the imagination. A 4-mana 4/3 that comes in tapped is not great, but the fact that every deck has access to it and you can get these if you need to trigger your 4-powered stuff is pretty nice. So I think this card's a D, but I think the fact that it can be cast in any deck means that it's going to see some play in the format. And also you can bump it up to like a D+ if you have stuff that cares about 4 power. Next up is Prism Id. This is a card that I don't love really ever for the fixing, but sometimes you need a 2-drop. It'll oftentimes come in as a sideboard card, as a sideboard 2-drop, which is quite nice when you need that. So I think Prism Id is probably just like a sideboard card for the aggro matchups, and then just like a D in the main deck. Sometimes you'll use it to fix a little bit, but I don't think you count it as a source of the color when you're fixing. You can count it as like a quarter of a source. If you're splashing red in your blue-white deck and you're splashing red, you can maybe like play your Prism Id, but you'll still want to play those 3 mountains or your 3 red sources. Next up is Radiant Fountain. This card's only really going to be playable in a monocolored deck, I think. You're not really going to want to hurt your mana for a colorless land just to gain 2 life. I can't really think of any exceptions to this rule. Maybe you have some insane life gain deck where you'll play Radiant Fountain as like an 18th land, but generally you want to make sure you have enough colored sources to cast your spells, and Radiant Fountain really doesn't help with that. So treat this as a like payoff for being a monocolored deck if those ever come together, but most of the time you're going to just see these cards go by, and the 2 life is definitely not worth the cost to your mana. Next up is Short Sword. This card is generally pretty low impact and generally not super playable. It's like a D level card. Sometimes it can make the cut in some of your aggressive decks. It does work nicely pumping up flyers a little bit, but generally it's just not high enough impact. 2 mana to give a creature +1/+1. Even if you can slowly spread that around, it's just not worth the card. And so I think Short Sword is better left on the sidelines. I was trying to think of a pun really quickly in my head there. I'm sure LSV will come up with one in his written set review, but yeah, Short Sword better left on the sidelines. Next up is Silent Dart. This can be removal in a pinch. Some color combinations really struggle to find removal, like for example blue-green decks oftentimes are the stereotypical decks that lack removal. In this format they have some, like Capture Sphere and whatever the punch with the counter is called. I still don't have all the names memorized, but Silent Dart is going to be a card that can sometimes fill a role in your deck. I don't think it's very good though. It's like a D and like a D+ if you really need removal, but it's not like a super high impact card. If it was, it would be a like premium pick, but Silent Dart, colorless removal is generally pretty clunky, and Silent Dart is no exception. It can do the job in a pinch, but generally not one that you're super happy playing. So just going to give this one a D, and then sometimes you'll just play it because you need that removal. Next up is Sky Scanner. It's like the opposite of Silent Dart. It actually is a very good 3-drop for pretty much any deck. 3 mana 1/1 flyer, draw a card is just quite nice. It can really punish 1 toughness creatures because it trades with them, even though it and it also cantrip, so you get that nice little value. It can trigger some stuff that cares about flyers in this set. There's not really any artifact synergies like there were last time we saw Sky Scanner in, I think, M19, but it's still going to be a really nice card for triggering those flying synergies. Works in a flyers deck, also just works in any deck. It can block flyers. It's just going to be a solid card. This card's going to be a C or a C+, depending on how much. It depends, first of all, on how many X1s end up getting played in the format. There's probably going to be a few running around, and also how much it being flying matters for various synergies. So I think it's probably going to be a C, and has potential to be higher than that depending on the format. That is going to do it for the set review, though. That's all of the cards, all of the commons in the set. I do hope you enjoyed it. Remember to hit that thumbs up button if you did enjoy it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future M21 content. In the comment section down below, leave a hashtag common ready, or some little hashtag to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video. Hashtag common ready is a pretty nice one. And also, if you would like to see a guide to the uncommons, to the rares, to the mythics, let me know in the comment section as well. I'm really excited for Core Set 2021. I think it's going to be a very fun set. Lots of different unique synergies to explore. It's always nice to explore new sets. So yeah, let me know all this stuff. You can catch me streaming the set live at twitch.tv/Nikolai Bolas. Be sure to follow over there. You can join the free Nikolai Bolas community Discord server. There'll be a link to that in the description and pinned comment to talk about all things M21. There's a whole subsection of the Discord just for talking about M21 and things like that. So yeah, that's going to do it for this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your feedback, and I will talk to you next time.